Welcome to the Home Building Hub, your essential podcast guide to building your new home. Hosted by industry experts Colin Bischoff and Darren Brennan, this conversational podcast will help better educate you about all things new home building so you can avoid costly mistakes and enjoy your building experience to the fullest, no matter which home builder you choose.
Hey there, folks, and welcome to the Home Building Hub. Colin here with co-host Darren Brennan. And in today's episode, we're going to give you a bit of a 101 class on block sizes, block types, what setbacks are, and all that sort of stuff, basically to give anyone out there who's looking to purchase a block or starting to talk to builders about getting the right house and land package. This will give you a really brief introduction into some of the requirements around what you can and can't do on blocks with your house design, but also just outline and give you some understanding around what some of those terms really mean, so you can make sure that you're well educated when you do go and purchase your block of land. So how are you going today, Darren?
Good, Cole. Going real well, mate. Obviously, spring weather's kicked in because if I turn my camera around and showed you out the window right now, the trees look like they're going to blow over. There's that much rain. It's ridiculous. And it's going to be a nice day in Ballarat. So bring it
Standard.
on. Bring it on, mate. You realise they do say it's the coldest place in the world. You realise on days like today, it's true. It's true.
A bit fresh. Yep. Yeah, so we'll kick off, Daz, with the fee for the podcast for the listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love if you could please share the podcast with any friends, family, and thanks to everyone who has. It's been fantastic. We are hearing more and more of that. I was talking to someone yesterday who had listened to the podcast. I was a bit like, oh, rightio, a little bit of surprise that was the case. And it's just, which was fantastic. And we want more and more of that to, share this information. The other part we'd love you to do is leave a 5-star review if you can, and it's pretty easy to do. So just click on the app that you're using and hit the button. It literally takes seconds, and it goes a long way to helping us grow the audience for the podcast. We also have a disclaimer for the podcast which says, whilst we are all about providing you value to you, this podcast should not be considered as legal or financial advice. It contains general information only, and you should seek out independent professional advice about your personal situation before making any legal or financial decisions. So I reckon I'm getting better at it, Cole. Sometimes a bit of a stutter on it, but we're getting through them time and time again now. It feels more and more comfortable. But today we want to talk about lots, blocks, different sizes and all what that means. And I guess the reality is there's 3 different types of lots. There's established lots, and what we mean by that is ones that are in areas where the homes are built up already, and that could mean that it's an old block that's just sitting there, been there for a long time, never built on, but the houses around it have been there for quite a period of time. It could also be a knockdown rebuild, so someone's bulldozing over the existing house and going to build a new house on that. We call those established lots. The next option is greenfield lots, and what we mean by those is brand new estates where every lot is getting developed at the same time. So they release a stage of lots and you've got a brand new street full of all vacant lots. We call those greenfield lots. And then rural lots or acreage lots. So again, that's pretty much a paddock. So, and again, they'll vary in size. So some of those will be subdivided from a really big paddock. It might have been, many hundreds of acres, and they've cut them into 10-acre lots or 2-acre lots or 1-acre lots, but they're all slightly different. But we'd call those acreage or rural lots. And again, they have a different set of requirements running with those. But in particular, we want to talk about the greenfield lots today. So, and there's a fair bit to talk about in terms of how that sort of applies, but there is sort of some common, sizes and rules that go with that. So some of that stuff to consider is that there's really, within the greenfield lots, 4 different types of lots. There's regular lots, meaning it's just a rectangular lot, very regular in shape. There's irregular lots, and they could, as an example, be at the end of a court, and so they could look like a pizza as the court rolls around it. You've got corner lots, pretty self-explanatory. It's on a corner, so it's got 2 streets or possibly 3 streets, depending on how it's situated, abutting that lot. You've got small lots, and what we refer to there is lots under 300 square metres. And then we also have medium density lots that again are getting smaller again, and we can see some of those even as low as, say, 50 square meters. So we're talking tiny blocks, and you kind of wonder how you're going to fit a house on that. But the medium density setup is, and what the medium density really means is they're going to build multiple houses at once rather than building one house at a time. So, yeah, that's probably some of the common sort of lots, I guess, Cole, and maybe you could lead through some of the more common sizes of lots. Lead into that, mate.
Yeah, so for those who are just starting their search or currently talking to land agents and trying to find the right block for yourself, buying a regular lot, that's where you'll find most of them. So that's that rectangular shape. But some people see value in buying as an irregular lot, like you said, so they can be a bit more of a triangle shape or an angled shape rather than a rectangle, and that can open up a bit of extra space in a side yard, for example. So if you've got the right design, irregular lots are actually usually they're more cost effective because they're harder to put a design on in most cases, and therefore they sort of fetch a bit of a lower price than a normal regular lot. So me personally, I think irregular lots are quite good if you've got the right design to go on there. We just want to cover off, just so you can understand what you walk into. Let's start with regular lots. So there's usually, when you go onto a land estate website or even a builder's website looking at floor plans, you'll find that there's some common sizes. So realistically, you're talking about 8 or 8.5 metres, and we'll start with the frontage, Darren. So essentially a regular lot is the lot width times the lot depth equals the total square meterage of a block, right? So 8.5 is one of the common ones. 10 or 10.5 another for the frontage. Probably the most common one would be a 12.5 metre frontage, and then there's also 14s and 16s. Okay, so understanding that years ago 14s and 16s at the front were just the norm, whereas now it's shifted into being more of 10.5s and 12.5s as the density gets tighter. Okay, so that's what you got to look out for is the common lot sizes, and you'll see those on what's, I guess, the sale pack as part of the land developer or land estate, but plan a subdivision is something we would use to see what those dimensions are. As far as depths are concerned, so you've got they can be any depth, right? But in terms of just keeping it general, they generally would start 21 metres deep, go to 25, 28, 30 or 32, and sometimes they can go up to 36 or even longer. But for the most part, I would say the most common lot size currently, Darren, somewhere around a 12.5 metre wide by about a 28 metre block depth, which would equal 350 square metres. That's probably the sweet spot at the moment. And as I said, a few years back, it was probably a 14 by 32 block, which is 448 square metres. So as the blocks get smaller, the designs have to accommodate also. Okay, so that's just a rundown on what you can expect to see in terms of the common block sizes that are available out there. And it's also just an understanding for you that, it doesn't have to be, you're not going to have some are 12.5 by 21, which is a really short block. Some are going to be, a lot longer. So as builders, we've got a range of different designs that suit those. But one of the things we want to cover today is that there's actually different sets of requirements around the size of block. Okay, so I'll get you, Daz, maybe if we could... that's formed, I suppose, by 300 square metres is the trigger. So if you've got a block under 300 square metres, Darren, or one that's over 300 square metres, what's the difference?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I did want to say, Colin, is those blocks are getting smaller too, as the density requirements by councils and stuff are driving them to become, they're adding more requirement per hectare. So I know when we spoke to Rory a couple of weeks ago, he spoke about exactly that. So, the density requirements currently are at about 16 blocks per hectare, and that's going to push up to possibly 21 blocks per hectare, meaning blocks are going to get smaller and smaller over time. So, yeah, these are some of the challenges that are going to be coming to the table for builders, and it means we have to become more efficient in terms of the designs that we put up and being able to build on those blocks. And it also comes back to affordability too. So, blocks have got smaller through affordability. But jumping back onto your question, the lots over 300 versus the lots under 300, I guess blocks over 300 square metres or 300 square metres and above. And I'll say that specifically because if you're at 299, you miss out. But if you're at 300 exactly, then you apply to a set of rules called Recode. And blocks under 300 square metres, they're subject to small lot housing code in a lot of estates. So we're talking about greenfields again. A lot of the estates now have small lot housing code applied to those lots. So they have to get a special permit as part of getting their planning permit for the estate. And what small lot housing code really is, it's just an easy version of getting a planning permit. So it is still a planning permit, but it's just labelled small lot housing code, but it's pretty much comply with those and it'll get ticked off. Comply with the requirements, it'll get ticked off. And if they don't have it designated as a small lot housing code lot, then you would have to get a planning permit, meaning you'd have to submit your plans to council with a whole set of extra requirements, and then it'd just take longer, and there's certainly no guarantees that they'll sign it off. Someone at council has to go, tick, 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 I think this is a good idea that you build that house on that block, and it could be that you've got certain, could be height, could be a bigger block on bigger house on a smaller block that they go, hold on, that's not normal, we don't think that applies, etc. Whereas small lot housing, tick the boxes along the way, and then it just flows straight through. Yes, it's a planning permit, but it's signed off by the building surveyor, so it's a much more streamlined process and really, really good. Now, Recode is a residential design code that was introduced back in 2001 in Victoria by the Bracks government, and it was to simplify the whole process of how big a house can I put on my block, what can I do, etc., to make that process easier and make it more affordable for people, less roadblocks, red tape to get through. So it applies to all land zoned for residential across Victoria, and it covers buildings heights up to 3 stories. So it's quite a broad coverage of homes. So if you're in a established area in a greenfields lot, then Recode applies. Building heights, some of the other stuff it does cover are things like minimum and maximum setbacks, building height, site coverage, car park requirements, so whether you need 1 or 2 car parks on site, site coverage, so how big the home can be compared to the lot size, permeability, and that means how much water, so you've got a certain amount of area that allows water in so that it can drain water away. Walls on boundaries, daylight to habitable rooms like living rooms or bedrooms, fence heights, solar access, so you've got to be able to get access to the sun to allow natural light into the home. Overshadowing, meaning your house being shadowing a neighbour or vice versa, your neighbour's house shadowing you. Private open space, being how big your backyard is, and there's certain requirements around that. And overlooking, meaning you can't just build a house and look into your neighbour's place if you're right near the boundary and wave to them, from upstairs. It's just not an acceptable part of building. And there's certainly things that happen. For example, if you're the first house to build in a street, then you don't necessarily have to comply with the same rules. Whereas if you're a house that's built later, that there's already established homes there, then you would have to consider overshadowing. So, and again, I don't say that they're the best necessarily outcome. I think both should have to apply to it, but they're the way the rules work, so people will play to the rules. What other ones there is there? Sorry, the other bit is the different states have their own version of the same thing, right? So in New South Wales, for example, they have BASICs. It's just a version of Recode. It's a certain set of regulations in which are complying to, you getting a permit to build your home. So, and their one takes in more information too, to be fair. So, the Recode's a pretty basic document. It's pretty easy to understand. Most builders will, they should be across every part of that and know that they're going to comply. There are also MCPs, or Memorandum of Common Provisions, which is essentially a building envelope and maybe some other little requirements that the developer will end up applying to the plan of subdivision. We've spoken about some of these things previously in some of the other podcasts. So, and what that'll do basically is that will often be put in place to either extend on Recode, meaning that it'll give you a setback that's closer to the street or potentially a setback that's further away from the street. It may also give you some height restrictions or some height exemptions. So again, some of these things will come into play that allow a little bit of rules outside of Recode. So the MCP would overrule Recode, and it's written into the title of the land and it's been signed off by the council. And then you've got the Small Lot Housing Code, which is basically an amended version of Recode to suit small lots under 300 square metres. So it's got to be 299 square metres or below. It again covers items such as setbacks, car parks, private open space, and so on. But basically it allows you to build a bigger home on a smaller lot. So they're saying, well, you've got this small lot. Let's give a bit of flexibility around what does that look like, and can we fit a slightly bigger home if we are smart about what we do there. So, allowing for private open space, some slightly different requirements around maybe we'll let the house be closer to the street, but as long as the garage is set back far enough to still allow for a car to park in the driveway, for example. So some of those sort of things are covered off under Recode. And it might be a great topic, I think, Cole, for us at some stage. We might run a podcast about both Recode and Small Lot Housing Code at some stage and run you guys through that and put some resources on the website. And I think we've got those things that we can add there at some point. But maybe, Cole.
I think, Daz, just on that, before we jump on the next one, it's notable to understand that, or even just what you've covered in the last sort of few minutes, Darren, is going to be pretty confronting for a lot of our listeners and viewers, and this is why we say to you that it's best to go to a builder and go to a land agent, don't just go to one and buy one. Like, don't go to land and buy a block of land without going to a builder, and sort of, don't just go to a builder, pick it, necessarily a plan without understanding a bit more about that block and that location and all that sort of stuff. So we say do it in tandem. And the reason for that is most of the plans that you see, I mean, really all the plans you see on a builder's website factor in Recode, or if they're a small plan, they factor in Small Lot Housing Code. So a lot of this you don't need to worry or stress about or even learn yourself. What we're trying to do is just highlight to you that there are a lot of variables, there are a lot of rules and requirements and regulations that need to be met. For the most part, designs will tick most of the boxes up front, and the base price will include that. But it's just important, I think, Daz, for people to understand that if they're going to take anything from this, is that there's a bit to cover, and we encourage you to talk to, if you're going to go get a block of land or a house and land package through a builder, we encourage you to talk to both parties, get a better understanding and just a general, basis of what you're purchasing, so you don't go and buy a block of land that doesn't fit a house that you're actually looking for, which happens all day, every day. And we keep spruiking that message, is like, don't go and buy a block of land unless you do have some understanding of what house you're going to fit on there, how big it's going to be, what those setbacks are. So the front yard, the backyard, and the side setback from the wall to the fence, in line with those requirements that we as builders must comply with. Okay, so,
and I think if I give a live example, I remember a friend of ours, Richie, he built a house in Point Cook, and at the time the neighbours had because you've got a minimum setback and you've got a maximum setback, and so they moved somewhere in between the two. So the house design that he was hoping to build, he now had to match the neighbours. He didn't realise, he didn't pay that much attention. He's an industry expert, mind you, and he didn't pay that much attention to the fact that the neighbour had pushed their house back. And when he went to get his permit, that all the way along thought, hey, the house is at 4 metres, but it was actually at 5. And then his house wouldn't fit because he had to match the neighbour. And then he had to go and apply for dispensation to try and overrule that. It was an arduous process. The neighbour next door was just a bit coy about it. They're like, no, bugger off, we don't care. They'd hog-tied him somewhat to what he was able to do. And, it was a pretty stressful time for him at that point. And that's quite a few years ago now. But these examples happen, and that's, I guess, be mindful that these things can pop up along the way, and don't get really cheesed off with your builder because they're unusual to happen. But when it happens, just work through a solution. There will be a solution, right? And it might be a little bit of adapting your floor plan, or it might be, modifying things slightly, or delaying the process by going through a dispensation, for example. But work with your builder to try and get a solution rather than just accepting that, that sort of, I'm upset and I'm angry. don't become upset and angry. Understand that these things can happen, I guess.
Yeah, I think a little tip there, Darren, would be if you're going to be buying a block of land from a real estate agent,
Yep.
it's potentially in a street that's already got houses most likely built around it. If you're going to do that, make sure you have a good understanding of what the neighbours, what they've built and how far back it is, because of that example you just shared. So it's something to consider. And you can go and get what's called a report and consent, which is approval for the neighbour to say, yeah, you can build it a little bit more forward of mine and things like that. But, ideally you want to avoid those sorts of things because they can reject it very, very easily, So that's why we keep saying, like, there's so many different variables and it's important to have these discussions up front and try and knock out as many of these potential, issues up front before it's too late, and they find out a little bit later down the track, okay? So I think the next one, Darren, we'll just give people a better understanding on I guess site plans and site coverage in combination, I suppose, with Recode and all that sort of stuff. So this episode is trying to just get you to understand the basics. So in theory, we've educated you on, some common block sizes, regulars, irregulars, corner lots, and small lots. Okay, so looking at those ones there, one thing to understand initially is you can't build. If you buy a block of land, you can't build on 100% of that block. You need room for a front yard. You need room for a backyard. You need room down the sides as well. And that's to allow for other areas of, private open space. So I guess a nice little area of backyard. Some other things with small lot housing code, there's certain sections, because they allow you to build on more of the block, there's certain areas where they want to make sure and maintain an unshaded area, which means that some of your backyard's going to get some sunlight through the day. Okay, so for Recode lots, now these are the ones over 300 square metres, generally, and not on every case, but generally they'll allow up to about 60% of what we call site coverage. So that means that your house can make up and take up 60% of that overall block size. Most builders' plans are already going to be designed on the basis of about 55 to 60%, depending, on the lot that they're designed for. And that's something just to consider when you start looking at builder websites and designs. And that's why you see, for example, when there's a house, a lot width, 12.5, and the design on the website says, designed to suit 12.5, the width of that house is probably going to be about 11.1 metres wide, because it's accounting for, 1.2 metres down one side, and usually from the garage to the boundary, they've only got about 200 mil gap. And you can have that on a zero lot, which means build the garage on the boundary, which would open up the other side of the house to be 1.4 metres wide, for example. But that's why you see different block size and then the houses, their width, their dimension, their depth, etc., a little bit more narrow to factor in all of these requirements we're sharing with you now. Okay, so regarding small lot housing code, if we've got the ones over 300 allowing you up to 60%, small lot housing code actually has two different types. So there's a type A and a type B, and they have essentially mostly the same rules, but there are some variations. And so a type A block, because it's a smaller block, and as Darren said, you can build a bit more on the block, up to about 90% of the block you can cover with your home. They allow you a smaller front setback. So, for example, type A, you can have a 3 metre front setback, as opposed to Recode that we talked about, where you probably need a 4. With a type B, you can actually go even closer, 1.5 metres from the street. You can have your house sitting there, or more than that. So I guess I don't want to get too much into the detail, Darren, I guess, for our listeners, but just take away a couple of things. If you're over 300 square metres, you can build usually about 60%. If you're under 300 square metres, you can get a design that almost gets up to 90%, because you're allowed to push the house further, because you're allowed to build to boundary for a bit longer and things like that. But again, the neighbouring property can impact the length of that, that wall you build on boundary is restricted, so things like that need to be looked at by your builder, by your sales consultant, to make sure it does comply. And in most cases, they can, if they're, I guess, skilled enough, the consultant, they can go through it and tell you. Alternatively, they can send it into the office and get someone, in the drafting team to have a look as well. Okay, so
and in
hopefully that helps. Yeah,
with the small lot housing code, it is a little tricky. right? So
Yeah.
you've got
Yeah.
this unshaded private open space requirement, and then your fence can be shading it. So if your fence is a little bit taller, then that's, the fence is already there, and instead of being 1.8 meters, it's 2 meters. Now that shades a bit bigger area, and it gets really tricky. So sometimes your sales consultant will say, look, I just need to get some advice on this. Yep, I've ticked all the boxes, but I'm a bit worried about this and this. Let me just get some advice from the office. We'll get our drafting team to actually draft this thing up for you as a site plan and just check that some of these things are going to work. Because the last thing you want to find out is you're a long way down the path and you find out it doesn't work. And then you're back to the drawing board, picking a new home, etc. So, if you've got plenty of room, great. But if it's getting really tight, it's worth getting it checked and just being sure that it's going to actually comply. And I've certainly worked at a builder at one stage where we had to cancel a number of jobs because we just couldn't get them to work, and they'd overlooked the shadowing of fences, and that's why I particularly mentioned that. And all of a sudden, all these houses didn't comply, so they were going and applying for permits, and then they were saying, no, I can't give you a permit. Doesn't comply. So, we don't want to get to that point with customers, so get that right advice and ask plenty of questions of the sales consultant. If you're unsure, you can always reach out to us as well. We'd be happy to assist in any way we can help there too. So
Yeah, we will. And I think with smaller housing codes, so they're appealing small lots because they're price conscious. They're obviously cheaper being the smaller lot. And these days builders have got great designs, that can fit those. Now, most of the designs you see on a website, let's say a block that's 12.5 meters wide by only 21 meters deep, as an example, that would be sitting in the small lot housing code territory. And one thing to keep in mind, or keep, I guess, something to be factored in when you're looking at the website and the designs, a 12.5 by 21 meter design, it's basically saying it's ready to fit. Usually it's a type A, Darren, so a 3 meter front yard and a 3 meter backyard. Now, what Darren's saying with the shade or the shadow is, if your block is facing north or south, the 3 meter rear setback that's been allowed for actually won't comply. Okay, so just keep those things in mind. If you're looking for a small lot housing code house, they're usually starting at a 3 meter front, 3 meter back. So if you're facing west or you're facing east as a block, they're okay, because the shadow that cast is coming from the side fence, and that opens up the width of the block. You've got that extra area to be unshaded, so to speak. If you're facing north, it's actually the house that casts the shadow over your backyard, and therefore you probably need to, usually it's about 4.6 meter backyard that's required as a result to then create that extra 2 meter of unshaded area. Okay, so it's something to, I guess, talk to your consultant about, because it's definitely important. And again, Darren, like you said, I've seen people caught out on that many times. Yeah, so
I think the joy is, as these, and it's a fair way down the track from when small lot housing code was introduced now. But what's happened is developers got smarter about it. So they tend to not have as many north or south facing lots that are small lot housing, because they realise that they've got difficulties in getting them to comply. Or they go from 21 to say 22 or 23 metre deep and allow a bit more backyard space. So the same design fits on there. So developers are working with it. The other part is also builders are smart with that now too. So they go, hold on, we have a design option that changes the setup of the back of the house, and it gives, changes how that lays out, and it now all of a sudden it actually works. And we've got one that's on a left-hand driveway and a right-hand driveway. So everyone's working to try and find an outcome to these sort of problems. Yeah. And it's just talking to the right person to make sure that, you're getting that right advice along the way, and that they're, considering those things. So, it's certainly not out of the norm. And the builders and the developers are always working towards finding a great solution for the customer, which is terrific. So
no, it's good. So we've covered some common lots for you. We've covered a bit about Recode, a bit about smaller housing code. I think to help wrap it up, Darren, let's give the guys a bit of an understanding, a little bit deeper on exactly what a setback is and what are building envelopes. That'd be helpful.
So a setback, I guess, is the distance between the boundary, being the fence line, and the house. So, for example, a house with a 4 metre front yard would be considered, it's got a 4 metre setback. So we're talking, and often there's not fences on the front of houses these days, so it's actually the edge of the property line. Wherever your planner for subdivision says that's the front of your block, your setback will be from that to the home. Again, there can be some allowable encroachment, so areas of the home that can push forward of that. So it could be a porch or a portico or something like that under a certain height might be allowed to encroach into that. Recode and smaller housing code specifically set out what you can do here. So they both specifically say you can be this far from the front, this far from the back, these sort of distances from the side, and they detail that off. So it is very much set out what you're allowed to do, and then it's also subject to what your neighbours have done. And I gave that example earlier of our friend Richie. But, for example, if the neighbours move their house, instead of being at 4 and now at 6 and they're already built, then you actually have to build to the same depth as them or go and get approval to move your house forward. So, and that's not guaranteed that you'll get that approval. So I guess one thing I will say is it does pay to build first. So if you're thinking about holding off building, and your neighbour, for example, builds a 2-story home, that could have a direct impact on what house you can build. They build their house further back. That can have a direct impact on how your house is built and what house you can actually build on your block. So be mindful of the fact that that's the case. Likewise, if the neighbour's already built a single and you want to build a double story, you might be now overshadowing their home. So that can have a concern. So get in earlier, you'll have less of those problems. So, and again, we know in this current market, a lot of people are delaying their build. They're thinking, I'll just hold off a little bit longer. Maybe prices will get cheaper or maybe I'm undecided on whether to build or sell. And then they realise later down the track, it's pretty hard to sell their block right now. Then you're almost better off making the decision if you can afford to build, because you'll have a more flexibility around what you're actually able to do on your block of land within the rules. So that's number one. So Recode and smaller housing code obviously dictate private open space as well. So they will say you need to have a certain amount of area that is considered private open space. And what they mean by that is a fenced off area that's accessible for you privately to have a barbecue in, kick a ball in, do whatever you like. And it can also be front yard. It doesn't necessarily have to be backyard, but if it is front yard, it's got to be accessible off a living space. It's got to be fenced, etc. So, these are all part of those same codes, smaller housing code and res code. There'll be further restrictions potentially in some of the greenfield estates that the developers put in place around setbacks. So they might also say, well, actually, we want you to be set back slightly further. We want the street to look better. So we've decided we want a 5 metre or a 6 metre setback. It could be on a boulevard entry sort of statement piece to an estate. And they go, we want 6 metre setbacks, but we also want to set a double story requirement because we want to have big, grand houses on the entry to the estate to make the estate look good. So there'll be some examples of those. There will also be another range of requirements from the estate, and we've spoken about estate covenants before or estate requirements. So it could be you need a water tank, a certain roof type. They may restrict the type of materials that you're using, etc., or encourage certain other materials. So they'll also be part of all the things that are getting considered when you're building your home. And again, your land developer should be making you aware of those items, but also your builder should be running through those and discussing those items with you, because not all of those items are free. So if you need to, for example, add a water tank, it's going to come at a potential cost. So understand that that's the case. If you need render on your facade, it's not included, it's going to come at a cost. So just make sure you're budgeting for those things.
One thing, Darren, that I think people overlook, or just a little tip for people. So we're learning that there's certain setback requirements to the front wall from the front boundary. So that's a tick. We've got that understood and clear. One of the requirements that developers put out there a lot is the garage setback. Now, for the most part, a garage setback is going to be shaped in two different ways. Number one, the developer says, or the greenfield estate, land estate says, your garage has to be 5 metres, or it has to be 5.5 metres. And alternatively, the other way that they can do it is they can say that your garage must be set back a certain distance behind the front wall. So let's say if your bedroom is at the front, and behind that front bedroom wall, they're saying you need to be 800 mil or a metre or whatever it is set back behind that for your garage. Okay, so one of the ways I see people get caught out, so it's just FYI for people just looking at plans, sometimes a plan is designed to meet a 4 metre front setback and a 5 metre garage setback. It's as the standard plan by the builder. But if that estate requires you to have a 5.5 metre garage and you've got a really short block, sometimes you can't push the whole house back by an extra 500 mil. So you may need to redesign the rear of the home to accommodate pushing the garage back 500 mil further to achieve 5.5. So these are little things, and again, why we encourage you to talk to the builder in combination with the land people to address these covenants, because it's one I've seen people get caught out on as well, Darren. So yeah, make sure you're looking at that garage setback requirement.
And I think that the design guidelines is a great document for the consumer to have a read of as well. So if you're buying a block of land, you could go and read the whole land contract, but half it's legal jargon, stuff you'll never understand, right? And not expected to understand, right? You pay a conveyancer for that. But your design guidelines, they're usually pretty consumer friendly. You can have a read through and it'll say front setback, side setback, rear setback. It'll say the other requirements that they've got in there. It'll talk about other bits and pieces that they want you to consider when building a home there. And more often than not, they're doing that to try and shape the community that's there. I think design guidelines are a great thing. I think it does set a benchmark of a minimum requirement for the home, which is great. And Recode's doing exactly the same. Just the developer guidelines are taking that to the next level, which I think is fantastic. Yeah. And when you drive into estates that have got quite strict design guidelines, they generally look better, right? So I understand that that's the case. And it's just have a read through it. It's not often that they're really arduous. I looked at one just this week, and it was a 2-page document. Like, I had time to read 2 pages. I've looked at some. There's an estate in called Amesbury, and I think there's this 300 pages long. So that's pretty arduous to sit there and read through and try and understand. So we're not expecting that. And there's probably a short form version of that. And a lot of the builders have that, or the developer will give you a short form version. But it's just. Often they're not very long. So have a read through and make sure you understand. And you can be highlighting that to the builder as well, saying, I did pick up on this. Do I need to do that? And they'll give you some advice. That might be a standard inclusion. So no, you don't. Or actually, it's not a standard inclusion. Yes, you do. So I guess at the end of the day, there's a range of rules and requirements that you've got to comply with in order to get a building permit and go ahead and build your home. And to make sure that your home complies. And what we always say is, don't go purchase the block until you've had a chat with the builder. And the market's never been better to be able to do so, right? So blocks aren't selling every minute. Like in a really hot market, they're not having a launch and people camping out for most cases. So, if it meant that you missed out on lot 14 by 32 here, you'll probably get the one next door that's 14 by 32 as well. So it's probably not so bad, right? So you've got a little bit of time to make a decision. So certainly ask those questions of your builder, and make sure that you're considering that home and how those restrictions are going to impact on that home for you, so that you get the right block and the right home on that for you that you're really happy with. So I guess that's sort of where I see it, Cole.
Yeah, I think the design guideline documents they're really helpful now, and they're pretty easy to read, or a lot more simple than they used to be. And other areas like the colours you can use, the plants you can plant, the fencing type that's going to be there. Is it colour bond, or is it going to be what's called capped timber fencing with exposed posts? Because all these things can cost you a bit more if you're going to do that landscaping later, or if you're going to go through a company that does full turnkey as well. So all this stuff, it's really it's called a guideline because estate requirements, because they're the things we need to put in the quote up front to factor in. And as you said, Darren, I think if there's an estate that's got a few more guidelines, I wouldn't say 300 pages worth, but if there's 20 pages or so and they've got some visual imagery and stuff, then there's not too many things. But I think that's a good purchase because it's going to discourage too many investors around you. Okay, so don't be scared of an estate that's got a few extra goodies that cost you a bit more up front, but what they do is they deter those investors because they're going to the estates with the 1 or 2 page requirement documents because it costs them less. Okay, so one thing, I guess, just to wrap this up, as we talk today, Darren, the codes that we're talking about are in place today. And if you buy a block of land and build a house now, this year in 2023 and into the early stages of next year, all of what we're saying will apply. But one thing to note is if you're going to hold off a little bit, please understand that next year, and in some states already in place, are changes to the codes. Livable housing will require some changes with design. So small houses will not look like small houses today. They won't look like the same next year because they're going to need wider hallways and turning circles out the front of toilets and things like that. There's extra requirements which probably make it more difficult to get 3 beds on a small lot.
Turning circles outside toilets for wheelchairs. So we're talking about accessibility for essentially less abled or disabled people, so people moving into elderly age and having access to a walker or something through the home, or someone who may well be in a wheelchair, and that sort of access. And you're right, Cole, with respect to that, even stuff like small lots with fall are going to become very challenging because you've now got to have a platform to get a wheelchair into the home, and that's going to be a real challenge to make it work. Most builders are going to have that happening through the garage, so you'll drive your car in the garage, have enough room to get a wheelchair out and come in through the garage into the home. But that won't always be the case either, because in some cases they're going to have to drop the garage or lift the garage or play with all these things based on fall. So it's going to be a challenging time next year when these rules start to apply.
So for those listening, for those watching right now, and you're still interested in purchasing the next, call it 6 months, you'll probably be subject to these guidelines. And if you're getting a deposit in, getting your plans drawn, then you should be subject to this. But just for those who are not quite ready, still saving deposit, etc., you will most likely be subject to the new guidelines proposed to be released in Victoria May 1st next year, already released in some other states, and for that livable housing, and also for 7-star energy rating, which is a whole new topic to talk about as well. So we have recorded an episode on 7-star energy rating to give you a bit of an education and insight from a bit of a superstar of knowledge base there, but the guy's name is Brian Haynes from Energy Lab. So that's episode 24 if you want to go and have a little listen or a watch. But other than that, Darren, I think, we've definitely covered something that's probably a little more complex as a topic, but hopefully people today can take it away, some of the points around what, setbacks are, some common lot widths, what a small lot is versus a Recode lot, etc. Anything else to finish off?
I think, like I said earlier in the podcast, if you do have any questions around any of that and you just need a little bit of advice, reach out to us, jump on our website, homebuildinghub.com.au, and just there's a section there you can send us an email from there, and we'll happily respond to that and try and give you some advice to help you along the way.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, folks, thanks again for listening. We really appreciate the feedback we're getting, and every week, every day, there's more downloads coming, and it's just good to watch for us, Daz. We're getting a lot of feedback, a lot of good comments, which is great. So if you like what you watched, like what you're listening to, please jump on, give us a 5-star review. And again, as Darren said, if you've got any questions, just jump on the website. And other than that, we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Cheers.